So apparently the little sermon series that the narrative lectionary has put us in for this span of time is ruining your favorite children's stories from the Bible. Because, man, the story of Joseph is a mess. It's just this wonderful train wreck of jealousy, bad parenting, greed, and lust, all wrapped in this multicolored package. Because it all begins with Jacob having a very obviously favorite son, Joseph, the first son of his very favorite wife. Joseph was a brat. Joseph was a tattletale. But Jacob spoiled him, which, of course, what makes a tattletale better than a spoiled tattletale? Because Jacob buys him this beautifully ornate robe. And then he goes and has the genius idea of telling his brothers that he's having all these dreams, that he's going to rule over them someday. Just what brothers want to hear from their little brother, right? Joseph was one of those people that it would be really hard to like him. Now, of course, his brother's reaction to Joseph being a snobby, spoiled snitch was a little bit extreme as well. They decided that they were going to kill him. Now, the oldest brother, Reuben, talked them out of this murder, not probably because he cared all that much for Joseph, but because Reuben had about the chapter before, Reuben had decided it would be a good idea to sleep with one of his father's wives. So Reuben was probably trying to get on his dad's good side by saving his favorite son after he was on his dad's bad side. Why? So Reuben convinced the other brothers to throw Joseph in a pit instead of killing him. We'll just throw him in the pit because Reuben was going to come back and save him later. Reuben went off and did some Reuben stuff, and the other brothers were looking off in the distance and saw some traveling Arab traders. And Judah had a great idea. Let's sell him. We don't make any money if we kill him. Because, Judah's a stand-up guy who does stand-up guy things like selling his brother into slavery. So that's what they did. They got him out of the pit. They sold him to the Ishmaelites. And Joseph ends up sold to an Egyptian. In the meantime, of course, while they didn't want to actually kill Joseph, they sure felt fine with convincing their dad that Joseph was dead. So they took his bright and fancy coat and covered it in goat's blood and said, "Look, your son got gored." Which is just the news that, everyone in this story is terrible. So Joseph finds himself in Egypt, enslaved to a guy named Potiphar. He's very successful in what he does because the Lord is with him, and he rises through the ranks to become the head of Potiphar's household, where he begins to come to the attention of Potiphar's wife, who starts to make advances at Joseph, which Joseph refuses. But she continues to make advances, and Joseph continues to refuse. Until finally, Joseph gets accused of being the aggressor, which is easy to do when his clothes got left behind when he fled the room, and he ends up thrown into prison. While in prison, Joseph continued to do the things he always did because the Lord was with him. He ended up the head trustee over all the prisoners. And this is where today's reading ends, but we know where the rest of the story goes. Pharaoh ends up throwing a butler and a baker into the prison. They both have dreams. Joseph interprets the dreams, says that the butler will go back to work and the baker will not. And butler goes back to work. A couple years pass. Pharaoh has a really weird dream. The really weird dream involves cattle and ears of corn, and it's just all very confusing and no one knows what it is. And that's when the butler remembers, hey, I know a guy named Joseph in prison. Remember when you threw me in prison? Actually, don't remember why you threw me in prison. Let's just keep that on the side. There's a Joseph guy in prison. He'll help you out. Joseph gets out of prison. He goes to Pharaoh. He interprets the dream to mean that there's going to be 7 years of good and 7 years of famine. And Joseph ends up being put in charge of the stockpiling of Egypt for the famine, ends up second in command over all of Egypt. And long story short, his brothers do indeed end up bowing down to him. But of course, as time went on, after Joseph and all his brothers and all their kids died off, well, it didn't go so well for the people of Israel in Egypt, and they ended up finding themselves enslaved and in misery. But that's not part of this story. I think the most interesting thing about the story of Joseph is the scene in which someone in authority takes advantage of their position and then, when refused, punishes the subordinate. It's an interesting thing that most of us can all relate to, where someone in power abuses their power and then punishes someone for their abuse of power. Powerful people have always been taking advantage of the less powerful. It's something that God is always against. Most of the Old Testament prophets are railing about the people of Israel taking advantage of the poor, the widows, the oppressed, all of the vulnerable people that the powerful always exploit. And yet it's something that God is very clearly not for. In the Beatitudes, Jesus lays out this wonderful picture of happiness for the people who have nothing, to the people who are hopeless, grieving, humble, hungry, pure in heart, peacemakers, harassed. The kingdom of heaven is about the Josephs of the world. And it includes a call for God's followers to stand up against those that would take advantage of them. Unfortunately, all too often, the church finds itself on the side of the powerful. The church ties itself to powerful people and allows the exploitation of the less powerful to continue. There will always be those in power seeking to take advantage of those under them, but it's up to us to stand for those who have no voice, to stand for those who have been in a situation like Joseph, where they had a superior try to do something to them, and then no one would listen to the person with no power. This is what we are called to do because this is how Jesus lived his life. When he's talking to his disciples about how to live out the great commandments, how to live out loving God and loving neighbor, he gives an example of someone beaten and left for dead on the side of the street. How do you love your neighbor as you love yourself? You take care of the person beaten and left for dead on the side of your street, even if they are your enemy. You reach out to those who are powerless and help them. You take the resources that you have and use them to the benefit of those without. The kingdom of heaven has always stood against the powerful's oppression of the less powerful. It's the entire plot of the Gospel of Luke. And we see that in Joseph's story. We see that in the Beatitudes. We see that in Jesus' parables. But unfortunately, all too often, we don't see it in the church. And we haven't seen it for altogether too long. Where the church instead seeks to be its own power and not help the powerless. And so that the question that we are left with is, how do we reach out to the powerless? How do we stand for those who cannot stand for themselves? How do we speak on behalf of the Josephs of the world, subject to what amounts to a sexual assault, and then falsely accused of the very crime that was committed against him? How do we stand for those people in the world? Because that is who God stands for. Over and over, that is who God stands for. And he calls us, his people, to give them a voice so that we are their advocate. Because that is what God calls us to do, to love our neighbor, to help the person in need, to speak for the voiceless.